I wanted to raise awareness about familiar spirits because they're biblical. It's biblical, but a lot of people aren't being taught uh, the facts. They're not being taught the facts, and they're being led to believe through different interpretations of the Bible that there's something else. Some of the versions have this verses referring to ghosts, but ghosts and familiar spirits are not the same. The familiar spirit is actually a demonic spirit. It is a spirit that's attached to someone who generally is conjuring the dead or their medium of some kind. But in the case of the person that I am going to share with you how I came to personally know firsthand, having interaction with familiar spirit. This person, my first husband, his name was Bruce, he practiced the occult. He had his own religion, and he actually probably received this familiar spirit through his occult practices. He had actually started his own religion, and but primarily the way was that he had an altar. He had an altar that he had created that was part of this religion he had done. And this religion, the symbol of the religion, was a play off the Christian cross. He had added several other arms to the cross to represent pathways. So anyways, every night he would make prayers to the different earth powers. And this actually got him involved with having a familiar spirit, and a familiar spirit became attached to him and was actually serving him. However, he had not any conscious awareness or direction of it until the familiar spirit made itself known to me. It made itself known to me. First of all, I want to say that my first husband, his name was Bruce Cole. He passed away in 2020. I hadn't known this, but probably, I'm just speculating, it could have been through coronavirus that had taken his life. He had been 85 at the time. Now, the two men I had been married to, they were both considerably older than I was. So my Bruce, he was 23 years older than I was, and at the time that we actually got married, I was 21 and he was 43, I believe, 43 or 44. He was 44. So there was an age difference. And my second husband, he actually was even older. He was 31 years older than I was. And but it's interesting that they both had birthdays in May, and through separate situations, they both passed away. In fact, I hadn't known that my first husband had passed away except through a interview that I was having through the state of Florida, where they used it as some kind of security question to me. And that's how I learned he had passed away 3 years prior to that. But because I purposefully did not keep in touch with him when I discovered his familiar spirit still trying to get in bed with me. So I wanted to explain this. I wanted to explain to you so you can understand how what's said in the Bible about familiar spirit is actually factual. It's factual. I have my own personal experience to share about it, and the experience was through my relationship with someone who was heavily into the occult and who had a familiar spirit. And so the one scripture really, there's a couple of scriptures here, but Isaiah 29 touches in the King James, where it says, "And thou shalt be brought down, and shall speak out of the ground, and thy speech shall be low out of the dust, and thy voice shall be as of one that hath a familiar spirit out of the ground, and thy speech shall whisper out of the dust." Well, some of the versions have ghost and other things, but familiar spirit is actually different. And this is what I came to learn, that Bruce actually had attached to him. And the first time that I met this familiar spirit, I had been I had been 21, and Bruce. Now, what I want to first show you is before I do, because this is a time and day where there are many myths that are popping up, and it's even harder to tell what's true. So I'm going to give you some fact checks here showing you that, yes, I was married to this man. It's not something I may have boasted. Maybe I shouldn't be boasting of it. I'm not boasting of it. But for instance, he actually, in his later years, he became kind of a little personality. He became a storyteller. And on YouTube, you can see him being interviewed here. He called himself Nicholas the Storyteller.
But we have another guest in the studio, Nicholas the Storyteller. And Nicholas, what happened to your last name? Is it the Storyteller, your last name?
When I was born, they didn't care much about last names.
Yes, and when were you born?
1520.
1520. That makes you 15200.
Don't try it.
Very old, Mr.
Yes.
And he actually kept his true identity hidden at the time. And what I find interesting is that at that time I had parted ways with him. But in this particular interview, which was 3 years ago, he was wearing the hat, the medieval hat that we actually got married in. We got married. He was wearing this particular hat and costume, and we got married in 1980. So he kept on to that hat. What I really like about this little film that I'm showing you here is that it captures a vignette of what Bruce and I did twice a week. Twice a week. He'd come pick me up at my mom's house, as I'm showing here.
Well, I'm not going out with Bruce. We'll take you on a ride through some places you've been through. Bye, Chinling. Bye-bye. And here's Bruce. He's got the car all running.
Hi, Richard and Linda. How you doing? Let's go for a ride.
We go off in this beaten up old car that actually had been a car of his mother's that she gave him. You see how beaten up that car was? He had no money. So I just wanted, I can through that establish to you, just because he was 23 years older than me, I wasn't with him because of money. He had nothing. He was a social worker, and they made no money, okay? No money at all. I think his salary was about $12,000 a year for getting a master's degree. So anyways, he would pick me up at my mom's house, and then we would we'd go to the house because I had 2 dogs over there that stayed over there. Where he's standing, he's in front of the side of the bed where I had was my side of the bed, and the side where the altar was his side of the bed. And when I'd seen the familiar spirit would come from the front of where my side of the bed was. It would be in the room. It would just come into the room, and it would walk in front of the bed where he's standing now. It would go in front of the bed in the direction he's facing, and it would come around to the side, which was his side of the bed, and just go to climb into the bed next to me. That's what it would do. It would be trying to, I guess it's the symbol, I'm doing the symbolism of trying to get in bed with me. It wouldn't come on my side. It would go into his side, which I guess maybe is more symbolism that through his side, it was trying to enter into a relationship with me. Now that relationship, as I said, wasn't a relationship that was for me. It was for destroying me. And we would go out to eat, go to a restaurant.
Hi there, how you doing? Here I sit in the Pizza Hut. How you doing?
What are you eating?
Oh, I ordered a piazza, and it's
What kind of it? What kind is it?
it's called a Napoli.
A Napoli?
Yeah,
What ingredients are in it?
a lot of different cheeses. I think it's mainly vegetarian. Makes sense to have a fork and a knife with this one, I'll tell you. You don't need it with a pizza, but with this you need a fork and a knife.
We would be intimate. I would stay the night there, and he would bring me back the next day. That was twice a week, and it just made his mother livid, because her plan had been that he would just have nothing more to do with me, but he couldn't do it. But yet I didn't want to be perpetually like that. But I just able to show you here, though, that such a vignette. When he would pick me up, drive over to his house, and because I use that for him to entertain my family members with his knives, because he collected a lot of knives. At the same time, it captured his altar that he kept there in that very room where that familiar spirit had been. And as well, you can see him all very clear inside of the Pizza Hut. That's why I'm showing it there, because inside the room you kind of see him, but inside the Pizza Hut you can have definite knowledge that this is the same person who was Nicholas the Storyteller on YouTube. Because at this point, when he was doing this Nicholas persona, I came to understand that he completely hid his real name. Nobody really knew who he was. In fact, in this particular interview, when I had seen it, I saw he was still being cryptic. He couldn't give them a straight answer. He wouldn't tell them anything about themselves, and they were kind of tolerating, but they were getting a little fed up with it. But anyways, the point is that this is the same person. This is the same person, Nicholas the Storyteller. And this Nicholas the Storyteller was a personality that I probably 30 or 40 years ago, we had been in a relationship, probably about 10 years or so, till I called it off. We had been married about 2.5 years. And then after that, we were together for about 8 or so years till I got fed up with that particular arrangement. He had an altar in that room. And this altar was where he had prayed to the earth powers, and where he actually was drawing many demonic spirits to the house. Now, at the time, I had been a backslidden Catholic. I'm not Catholic anymore, but I had been backslidden. I had nothing more to do with the Catholic Church, and I was really, like many people of the world, I had dabbled in the occult. My parents themselves, nobody saw any problems about going to mediums and following the horoscope. In fact, that's one strong connection that Bruce felt he had with me, in that he had been a Taurus, and it turned out that when he had my horoscope cast, that I was a triple Leo, and this was a big deal in the marriage, that, you know, I was a triple Leo, and he was a Taurus, and these forces together, and all this stuff like that. So, so at the time, he had been heavily into practicing magic, his own magic, because when he was in Berkeley, California, he had come up with his own religion. He had called it Transition, and it was actually an officially registered religion. He was the leader of it, although he didn't have any followers per se. He didn't pursue it, and when we were together there in Florida, but he used it kind of like a boasting spot, and he kept it up in his altar every night. So at the time, we had been married maybe a year or so, and he had gone off to work. And when I was laying there in bed, there was a man being that suddenly was there in the room. He was on the side of the bed where I was, but in front of the bed, and he came walking around the whole bed to go into the side where Bruce slept, and he was coming into the bed. And what I understood, he was trying to get in bed with me, and not so much for intimacy, but as a symbolism. He was trying to get in bed with me in overall. So that's the first time I saw him, and I had told Bruce about it. And I had seen this being. He would repeat the action when he would when my husband would leave, he would come around and repeat it when this being was alone, when I was alone, and make the symbolic route to go around the bed, to climb into the spot where Bruce lay, but to be in bed with me. And this was what the being, I suppose, was trying to do. And then he had made itself known to me. And at that time, I already knew that Bruce's incantations were only attracting demonic spirits like moths, because when we initially had been romantically involved and not been married, the first night I had spent in that house, I had fallen asleep with having a dream of a tent over a tent over a tent over the house, and many different kind of demonic beings, like out of a medieval carving. Those weird beings were fluttering around and hitting onto the tents like moths. And that's when I told him that dream I had. Then he had confessed to me what this thing was next to the bed. I thought it had been a decoration up to that point, but he had confessed to me it was an altar, and he said every night he would erect a tent. So I had come to know that his practice of putting a tent up over the house instead was like a beacon to demonic spirits. But anyways, that's how I'd come to be introduced to this familiar spirit that was attached to him. So when I had been 10 years of age, the Lord had given me a dream of the future where I would marry such a person as him. And his mother, in the dream I had, his mother had been a jealous witch, literally, and she was working against me. And this actually ended up being true. I had been 10 years of age. I knew I was going to marry a man whose mother was very jealous of me, and she would work at breaking up our marriage. Well, this is exactly what happened. His mother lived right next door to us. And this has to do with my familiar spirit story, okay? His mother lived next door to us. Her name was Laverne. And she owned both houses, and she had enticed him to come down by giving him an offer of the house that he was in when I had come to know him. And that was around 1977. And so he had already been married twice before. So when I came into the situation, I had met him through a club called SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism. And as you can see from the pictures, that he was dressed from medieval time. And after I had parted way with him, he apparently had gone on to this Nicholas the Storyteller, which had been just a little idea that he would sometimes joke with me, but he had made it afterwards into this public service he would do. He would go around various libraries and clubs and everything else and tell these medieval stories. So it became his personality. But anyways, what happened is that we were married 2.5 years, and there was I was in my early 20s, and his mother would invite him over, but she wouldn't invite me. And she actually then what she was trying to do was to get him to divorce me, because she had been jealous because he would spend time with me and not with her. So what he ended up confessing to me is that he ended up deciding to give in and to divorce me, but he would then stay with me. He would stay with me. He would pay for all my insurance and everything else. And his mother would be happy, but we would be together. Well, for a time we did that. For a time we did until I got fed up. I got fed up with that way. But one of the things I'm showing you is after we had pleased his mother by divorcing, but she wasn't pleased at all because she wanted me out of his life. But he had stayed with me. He would pick me up. We'd pick me up, and we would go on dates. And twice a week, it was part of our routine. He would take me out to eat. I would spend the night over there. And this is how we kept this long-term relationship for several years until one day I said, forget it. In fact, what he didn't know was that as soon as we were divorced, I was out with other men. I was out having intimate relationship with other men because as long as we were married, that was my loyalty. But as soon as that was off, that's how I felt about it. But he never knew that part. But anyways, the point is, one day I got up and I said, forget it. I don't want to keep this relationship. And I told him, look, Bruce, this is it. And so that ended it. It may have been about 7 or 8 years that we went on this particular way. And so it was another few years. Then I met my next husband, which, by the way, I had a future dream from the Lord. Also, I would meet a future husband. And so, anyways, my mother tells me that when I had just gotten married to my last husband, that Bruce had sent roses to my mother's house where I had been, but I was no longer there, and he was trying to start our courtship again. But I had gone off and I had been married my husband, so I didn't even reach out. I just had my mother, throw away the roses or whatever. I didn't say anything because I'm not going to contact him now. I was married to somebody else. So anyways, then of course my second husband, he ended up passing away, and that was in 2008. And about 3 or 4 years later, I was in the process of, actually, I was losing my house because we had a mortgage still on it, and I didn't have the income to retain it, but it was a several-year process. And so in that process, I was going through my possessions and getting ready in this thing of losing the house. And I had come across some pictures that I know that had meant a lot to Bruce. It was when he had been, I think he was in college. I think he was teaching college at Berkeley. And it was a couple of pictures he had there that I didn't realize that I had. So I said, I knew this meant a lot to him. So I had found his address, and I had shipped it off to him with a note telling him that I had found it. And so I knew he wanted these pictures. And so what that did is that got him to start writing me. And he started then to try to court me. And one of the things he tried to do was he sent me, he told me about his storytelling. And he sent me some CDs. He was living in another part of Florida. Some little town, Crescent City or something. And I was living in Pembroke Pines at the time. And these are a few hundred miles apart. And so he started trying to impress me that he was a published author, that he did these stories. And to do so, he sent me a CD of some of the poems and stories that he did. And what happened was this. This was in about, I don't know, between 2012 to 2014 when I had this contact with him again. I hadn't had contact with him since the late 80s. That's when I said, forget it. Okay, and then I had, when he tried to come back to me again, was in 97. And he had married again after me, but then he had divorced that woman. And then he tried again to come back to me, and that was in 97. And then, this was again in 2013. So then when he sent these things to me, and I had received it in the mail, and I had gone to bed that night, and I had gone into my bed, and the last time I had seen him, like I told you, was in the 80s. And we're talking about 2012, 2013, over 20-some years later, where I had any contact with him. And we were several hundred miles apart. And it was only by the mail. That's it, by the mail. Because I wasn't talking on the phone with him. And he had sent me, he was putting a toe at a time, trying to get it back into my life. And he sent me that, like I told you, to try to impress me. And it had come in, and I had gone to bed that night when I had gotten the CD. And I had listened to it. And then, like I said, I went into bed. And as I lay there in my bed, what did I see? The familiar spirit, the same familiar spirit from over a quarter of a century ago, was in my bedroom in Pembroke Pines, which the first time I had seen that familiar spirit, I was in Miami, Florida, in our house. We had been married. Here was the same identical familiar spirit, and what was that familiar spirit doing? The same thing it kept trying to do when I was a young woman with him, married in that house. It did the same thing. I was actually sleeping on the same side. I took to liking sleeping on the side of the the left side of a queen bed I had been in. And that familiar spirit did the same thing. It went from around the foot of the bed, or where the side I was on, where it appeared. And then it just walked around the front of the bed just like it did many decades ago, and it went onto the side where it had did before, where my husband Bruce had been, and he wasn't in there in that bed, but on the side that was empty, and it went again into the motions to climb into the bed where I was. And the moment that I had saw that, first I was stunned. I said, "Oh my gosh, this is the same spirit. He's got the same familiar spirit. It's decades." And I realized by accepting that CD into my house that it had given the familiar spirit a way in, a way in. And I want to share this with you because you can end up letting into your house demonic spirits through articles that belong to others, who are in the occult. You don't even have to know it. You can pick up something in the flea market that had been used by someone or in the possession of someone who was heavily into the occult, and you can let it can become a doorway through which the demonic can enter into your house. At that point in my life, I had become born again. I had been about 2 or 3 years, and I had, as a result of that, gone through the entire motion of getting rid of everything into my house that had any kind of occult ties whatsoever. I had cleaned my house because I'd come to understand the situation. So this is something actually that does happen. When you have something of, you don't even have to know. You don't have to believe. That's why the Bible talks about getting defiled. When God has talked about, don't touch these things lest you too yourself become defiled, because these things can defile you. They can allow portal ways. And here I was hyper aware of that because I had made sure to clean my house of anything that was from my past that had to do with demonic or occultism, because I had been a big lover of horror films. I liked Clive Barker stuff. I didn't know or understand the things I was doing. I enjoyed the good witchcraft stories and so on, but there's no such thing as good witchcraft. It's all occultic, and it's all has demons behind it. So anyways, here I had, though, cleaned my house of everything, anything whatsoever, and I had not even thought. First of all, I didn't think he would even be sending me a CD. But you know what? The devil, the principalities, you're waging war. You're having actions. You're really not doing with the flesh. You're doing with the rulers and powers of darkness, because they're all working to try to usurp our inheritance and to lead us off into damnation. That's the bottom line. So anyways, through him, they had been trying to snare me. So here, I remember I had been getting dreams I knew that were false dreams, that he was the one for me, and so on. And I knew that it was the enemy trying to get me to receive a dart and let him back into my life, because then it would ruin my Christianity to voluntarily enter a relationship with someone who was still doing the occult. He was still into his earth religion, okay? And he still had this familiar spirit from his practices. So this familiar spirit was attached to him. And here I didn't know, by him sending this to me, by my bringing it into the house, I let in the familiar spirit. Well, as soon as I saw that, I got up and I took that CD and I took everything that he had sent me, letter, his responses, and I tore them up, shattered the CD, threw it in the garbage. I deleted every reference on my computer, and that was it, and it shut the door. It shut the door. So I want to tell you that I have personally experienced the reality of familiar spirits, that they are helpers, servers. They attach themselves, and they're not positive helpers. Okay, they're you know, they are tying a person, leading a person into hell. So anyways, the point is that through his occult practices, through his chantings and his conjuring earth powers, he was in a way doing medium and necromancy. He read the tarot. He would read the tarot. He would do tarot for entertainment. He would do it at fairs, and for a long time he was into occult practices. And so I happen to know that he had this familiar spirit with him for decades as a result. And interestingly, the familiar spirit manifested itself to me with its intention manifested to me, that it was making efforts to try to become bedfellow with me, to get into bed with me, and that is very symbolic. It wanted to also get me through him to become intimate with me and become in a partnership with me. And I don't mean necessarily a sexual relationship, because that is a saying to get into bed, and it was showing me that's what it was. Its aim was to get into bed with me. And I'm trying to see here if I can explain better. With someone, get into bed with someone, meaning here on Google, and it's an idiom. It's an idiom, and this thing was using this idiom. It means to enter into a relationship with someone or something. And this thing was making known that it was trying through him to enter into a relationship with me. That it would keep repeating the motions was telling me that it wasn't being successful, because, of course, I, even though I was with him all those years, and I would dabble in the tarot, I kept my Christian faith. I didn't relinquish it. I didn't turn from it. But yet this thing was still trying to get into a relationship with me. And here, after all that time, just the first chance it had to enter into my house, almost reminds you of a vampire story where you open the door and you invite them in. Well, you know, this is demonic. It's demonic spirit. You invite the demonic. You can invite a familiar spirit into your house by merely accepting something from someone who has one. You don't even have to know. You don't even have to agree with it. And the way to get rid of it is you've got to toss that stuff out entirely. Entirely. You've got to totally toss it out of your house. And so when you do get things, I'm trying to raise your awareness. If you go to a flea market or something, you get an antique or anything that you may get from anybody, you always have to consider, is this someone who is doing something that is in the occult? Because in that case, you can't accept it, because you can be then allowing whatever demonic spirit they have the right to enter into your house. And it will try then to have a relationship with you. And you know it's not a wonderful relationship. It's not a love relationship. It's a relationship of deception to lead you to destruction.